Chapter 5, Part 1 of Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds by Bernard Lebovier de Fontenelle. Translation by William Gardner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The fifth evening's conversation. That the fixed stars are so many suns, every one of which gives light to a world. The Countess was very impatient to know what would become of the fixed stars. Are they inhabited, says she, as the planets are, or are they not inhabited at all? Or in short, what shall we do with them? You may soon guess, says I, the fixed stars cannot be less distant from the earth than 50 millions of leagues. Nay, if you anger an astronomer, he will set 'em farther. The distance from the sun to the farthest planet is nothing in comparison of the distance from the sun or from the earth to the fixed stars. It is almost beyond arithmetic. You see, their light is bright and shining, and did they receive it from the sun, it must needs be very weak after a passage of 50 millions of leagues. Then judge how much it is wasted by reflection, for it comes back again as far to us, so that forwards and backwards here are 100 millions of leagues for it to pass, and 'tis impossible it should be so clear and strong as the light of a fixed star, which cannot but proceed from itself. So that, in a word, all the fixed stars are luminous bodies in themselves, and so many suns. I perceive, says the Countess, where you would carry me. You were going to tell me that if the fixed stars are so many suns, and our sun the center of a vortex that turns round him, why may not every fixed star be the center of a vortex that turns round the fixed star? Our sun enlightens the planets. Why may not every fixed star have planets to which they give light? You have said it, replied I, and I will not contradict you. But you have made the universe so large, says she, that I know not where I am, or what will become of me. What is it all to be divided into vortexes confusedly, one among another? Is every star the center of a vortex as big as ours? Is that vast space which comprehends our sun and planets but an inconsiderable part of the universe? And are there as many such spaces as there are fixed stars? I protest it is dreadful. The idea confounds and overpowers me. And for my part, replied I, it gives me satisfaction. When the heavens were a little blue arch stuck with stars, methought the universe was too strait and close. I was almost stifled for want of air. But now it is enlarged in height and breadth, and 1,000 and 1,000 vortexes taken in, I begin to breathe with more freedom, and think the universe to be incomparably more magnificent than it was before. Nature has spared no cost, even to profuseness, and nothing can be so glorious as to see such a prodigious number of vortexes, whose several centers are possessed by a particular sun, which makes the very planets turn round it. The inhabitants of a planet of one of these innumerable vortexes see on all sides these luminous centers of the vortex with which they are encompassed, but perhaps they don't see the planets, who, receiving but a faint light from their sun, can't send it beyond their own world. You present me with a kind of perspective of so vast a length that no eye can reach to the end of it. I plainly see the inhabitants of the earth, and you have made me discover those who dwell on the moon and in other planets of our vortex. These inhabitants, indeed, I conceive pretty plainly, but I don't see 'em so clearly as those of the earth. After these we come to the inhabitants of the planets which are in the other vortexes, but they are sunk into so great a depth that though I do all I can to see them, yet I must confess I can hardly perceive 'em. By the expression you use in speaking of 'em, they seem to be almost annihilated. You ought then to call 'em the inhabitants of one of those innumerable vortexes. We ourselves, for whom the same expression serves, must confess that we scarce know where we are, in the midst of so many worlds. For my own part, I begin to see the earth so fearfully little, that I believe from henceforth I shall never be concerned at all for anything. That we so eagerly desire to make ourselves great, that we are always designing, always troubling and harassing ourselves, is certainly because we are ignorant what these vortexes are. But now I hope my new lights will in part justify my laziness. And when anyone reproaches me with my indolence, I will answer, "Ah, did you but know what the fixed stars are?" It was not fit, says I, that Alexander should know what they were. For a certain author, who maintains that the moon is inhabited, very gravely tells us that Aristotle, from whom no truth could be long concealed, must necessarily be of an opinion backed with so much reason. But yet he never durst acquaint Alexander with the secret, lest he should run mad with despair when he knew there was another world which he could not conquer. With much more reason, then, was this mystery of vortexes and fixed stars kept secret in Alexander's time, for though they had been known in those days, yet it had been but an ill way of making his court to have said anything of them to that ambitious prince. For my part, I that know him am not a little troubled to find myself not one jot the wiser for all the knowledge I have of him. The most they can do, according to your way of reasoning, is but to cure people of their ambition and their unquiet, restless humour, which are diseases I am not at all troubled with. I confess I am guilty of so much weakness as to be in love with what is beautiful. That's my distemper, and I am confident the vortexes can never cure it. What if the other worlds render ours so very little? They cannot spoil fine eyes or a pretty mouth. Their value is still the same, in spite of all the worlds that can possibly exist. This love, replied the Countess, smiling, is a strange thing. Let the world go how 'twill, 'tis never in danger. There is no system can do it any harm. But tell me freely, is your system true? Pray conceal nothing from me. I will keep your secret very faithfully. It seems to have for its foundation but a slight probability, which is, that if a fixed star be in itself a luminous body, like the sun, then by consequence it must, as the sun is, be the centre and soul of a world, and have its planets turning round about it. But is there an absolute necessity it must be so? Hear me, madam, says I. Since we are in the humour of mingling amorous follies with our most serious discourse, I must tell you, that in love and the mathematics people reason alike. Allow never so little to a lover, yet presently after you must grant him more. Nay, more and more, which will at last go a great way. In like manner, grant but a mathematician one little principle, he immediately draws a consequence from it, to which you must necessarily assent, and from this consequence another, till he leads you so far, whether you will or no, that you have much ado to believe him. These two sorts of people, lovers and mathematicians, will always take more than you give 'em. You grant that when two things are like in one another in all visible respects, it is possible they may be like one another in those respects that are not visible, if you have not some good reason to believe otherwise. Now this way of arguing have I made use of. The moon, says I, is inhabited, because she is like the earth, and the other planets are inhabited because they are like the moon. I find the fixed stars to be like our sun, therefore I attribute to them what is proper to that. You are now gone too far to be able to retreat, therefore you must go forward with a good grace. But, says the Countess, if you build upon this resemblance or likeness which is between our sun and the fixed stars, then to the people of another great vortex, our sun must appear no bigger than a small fixed star, and can be seen only when 'tis night with them. Without doubt, madam, says I, it must be so. Our sun is much nearer to us than the suns of other vortexes, and therefore its light makes a much greater impression on our eyes than theirs do. We see nothing but the light of our own sun, and when we see that, it darkens and hinders us from seeing any other light. But in another great vortex there is another sun which rules and governs, and in its turn extinguishes the light of our sun, which is never seen there but in the night with the rest of the other suns, that is, the fixed stars. With them our sun is fastened to the great arched roof of heaven, where it makes a part of some bear or bull. For the planets which turn round about it, our earth for example, as they are not seen at so vast a distance, so nobody doth so much as dream of 'em. All the suns then are day suns in their own vortexes, but night suns in other vortexes. In his own world or sphere, every sun is single, and there is but one to be seen, but everywhere else, they serve only to make a number. May not the worlds, replied the Countess, notwithstanding this great resemblance between 'em, differ in 1,000 other things? For though they may be alike in one particular, they may differ infinitely in others. It is certainly true, says I, but the difficulty is to know wherein they differ. One vortex has many planets that turn round about its sun. Another vortex has but a few. In one vortex there are inferior or less planets, which turn about those that are greater. In another perhaps there are no inferior planets. Here all the planets are got round about their sun, in form of a little squadron, beyond which is a great void space which reaches to the neighbouring vortexes. In another place the planets take their course towards the outside of their vortex, and leave the middle void. There may be vortexes also quite void, without any planets at all. Others may have their sun not exactly in their centre, and that sun may so move as to carry its planets along with it. Others may have planets which in regard of their sun ascend and descend according to the change of their equilibration, which keeps them suspended. In short, what variety can you wish for? But I think I have said enough for a man that was never out of his own vortex. It is not so much, replied the Countess, considering what a multitude of worlds there are. What you have said is sufficient for 5 or 6, and from hence I see thousands. What would you say, madam, if I should tell you there are many more fixed stars than those you see, and that an infinite number are discovered with glasses which are not perceptible to our eyesight? In only one constellation, where it may be we count 12 or 15, there are as many to be found as usually appear in the whole hemisphere. I submit, says the Countess, and beg your pardon. You quite confound me with worlds and vortexes. Oh, madam, I've a great deal more to tell you, replied I. You see that whiteness in the sky, which some call the Milky Way. Can you imagine what that is? 'Tis nothing but an infinity of small stars, not to be seen by our eyes, because they are so very little, and they are sown so thick, one by another, that they seem to be one continued whiteness. I wish you had a glass to see this ant-hill of stars, and this cluster of worlds, if I may so call 'em. They are in some sort like the Maldive Islands, those 12,000 banks of sand, separated only by narrow channels of the sea, which a man may as easily leap over as a ditch. So near together are the vortexes of the Milky Way, that I presume the people in one world may talk and shake hands with those of another. At least I believe the birds of one world may easily fly into t'other, and that pigeons may be trained up to carry letters, as they do in the Levant. These little worlds are accepted out of that general rule by which one sun in his own vortex, as soon as he appears, effaces the light of all other foreign suns. If you were in one of these little vortexes of the Milky Way, your sun would not be much nearer to you, and consequently would not make any much more sensible impression on your eyes than 100,000 other suns of the neighbouring vortexes. You would then see your heaven shine bright with an infinite number of fires, close to one another, and but a little distant from you, so that though you should lose the light of your own particular sun, yet there would still remain visible suns enough beside your own to make your night as light as day. At least the difference would hardly be perceived, for the truth is you would never have any night at all. The inhabitants of these worlds, accustomed to perpetual brightness, would be strangely astonished if they should be told that there are a miserable sort of people who where they live have very dark nights, and when 'tis day with them, they never see more than one sun. Certainly they would think nature had very little kindness for us, and would tremble with horror to think what a sad condition we are in. I don't ask you, says the Countess, whether in those worlds of the Milky Way there are any moons. I see they would be of no use to those principal planets which have no night, and move in spaces too strait and narrow to cumber themselves with the baggage of inferior planets. Yet pray take notice, that by your liberal multiplication of worlds, you have started an objection not easily answered. The vortexes whose suns we see, touch the vortex in which we are, and if it be true that vortexes are round, how then can so many bowls or globes all touch one single one? I would fain imagine how this may be done, but cannot reconcile it to myself. Madam, says I, You shew a great deal of wit in raising this doubt, and likewise in not being able to resolve it. For in itself the thing is extreme difficult, and in the same manner you conceive it, no answer can be given to it. And he must be a fool who goes about to find answers to objections which are unanswerable. If our vortex had the form of a die, it would have 6 squares or flat faces, and would be far from being round, and upon every one of these squares might be placed a vortex of the same figure. But if instead of these 6 square faces, it had 20, 50, or 1,000, then might 1,000 vortexes be placed upon it, one upon every flat. And you know very well that the more flat faces any body has on its outside, the nearer it approaches to roundness. Just as a diamond cut facewise on every side, if the faces be very many and little, it will look as round as a pearl of the same bigness. 'Tis in this manner that the vortexes are round. They have an infinite number of faces on their outside, and every one of them has upon it another vortex. These faces are not all equal and alike, but here some are greater, and there some less. The least faces of our vortex, for example, answer to the Milky Way, and sustain all those little worlds. When 2 vortexes are supported by the 2 next flats on which they stand, if they leave beneath any void space between them, as it must often happen, Nature, who is an excellent huswife, and suffers nothing to be useless, presently fills up this void space with a little vortex or 2, perhaps with 1,000, which never incommode the others, and become 1, 2, or 1,000 worlds more, so that there may be many more worlds than our vortex has flat faces to hear of. I will lay a good wager that though these little worlds were made only to be thrown into the corners of the universe, which otherwise would have been void and useless, and though they are unknown to other worlds which they touch, yet they are well satisfied with their being what they are. These are the little worlds whose suns are not to be discovered but with a telescope, and whose number is prodigious. To conclude, all these vortexes are joined to one another in so admirable a manner that every one turns round about his sun without changing place. Every one has such a turn as is most easy and agreeable to its own situation. They take hold of one another, like the wheels of a watch, and mutually help one another's motion. And yet 'tis true that they act contrary to one another. Every world, as some say, is like a football, made of a bladder covered with leather, which sometimes swells of its own accord, and would extend itself if it were not hindered. But this swelling world, being pressed by the next to it, returns to its first figure, then swells again, and is again depressed. And some affirm that the reason why the fixed stars give a twinkling and trembling light, and sometimes seem not to shine at all, is because their vortexes perpetually push and press our vortex, and ours again continually repulses theirs. End of Chapter 5, Part 1.